Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Streets and Eats. And today on the podcast, we are interviewing a couple of really interesting fellows. Iain, the road trip expert. Road tripping is near and dear to our heart. So we'll really enjoy talking to him. And his friend Adam, who is a serious mountain climber and a Guinness World Record holder. Welcome to Streets and Eats, the travel and food podcast dedicated to taking our listeners to the sights, sounds, and flavors of fascinating places near and far, both on and off the beaten path. We're Jim and Corinne Vale, and we've been traveling internationally and domestically together for decades, visiting more than 90 countries in all 50 states in the USA. We'll share all of the local knowledge and food expertise we've gathered through years of living as expats in Asia and Europe, as well as traveling with families spanning multiple generations around the world. Join us each week for a new adventure.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, I have climbed at least one mountain, Mount Fuji in Japan, probably the most climbed mountain by tourists. And I was up there for a sunrise, and it was a beautiful sunrise, and I really enjoyed it. But it didn't turn me into a mountain climber. So I'm just kind of curious, how you guys met and how you started on this journey of climbing the mountains in Europe.
Yeah, I suppose I can take that one first of all. So me and Adam knew each other through some mutual friends. This is around about the end of 2018. And essentially I posted in our group messaging group to see if anybody wanted to do a spontaneous trip to Norway, because I'd essentially booked a flight in 2 days' time to go and hike up to a fairly famous place called Pulpit Rock. Which is somewhere I'd seen online. And Adam basically responded and said that, he was able to take a day off or take a couple of days off work. And so we basically did a road trip together in Norway and did some hiking there. And that's essentially where it all started, really. We had a really good time on that trip. We got on really well together. And we actually had a third person with us who is another travel blogger. And then, as all good ideas start over a drink in the pub, we sort of got talking after that trip about what we might do with ourselves the next year. And then that's basically where everything started, really.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So that was your first one in Norway. And how do you go about devising a plan, because your goal was to climb all of the high points in the European countries, right?
Yeah, so it was a plan to do that, and we had to notify Guinness before we started our intention to break the record. You have to essentially get approval from them. There's a list of requirements you have to follow. But I am generally not the best at forward thinking and planning, so it was a very much winged approach. We took it as it went along, and it was constantly evolving the whole time. My main goal was just to do a bit of a road trip around Europe. I'd never taken a long break out of work before, so for me, a 3 to 6 months period off work was like my aim. But the Guinness World Record was kind of like just a bit of a cherry on top. I didn't actually think I was going to complete it when I started the challenge, I'm going to be honest.
What was the world record? What did you beat? And how fast did you do it?
So the record is, I was the fastest person to climb to the highest point in every European country in the quickest time. So we can get into, it's 44 official countries, but when we broke down the UK, we included Kosovo, which isn't recognised by some members of the United Nations. So in total, there was 48 peaks, which represented 50 different areas of Europe. So yeah, it was certainly a monumental challenge. Some varies, of course, you expect. Some are only kind of less than 100 meters high. We went to even the micro-states like Vatican City, all the way up to Mount Elbrus in Russia.
Some of them would be pretty tall. That's true. But then again, I'm thinking of like the Netherlands. There can't be too much height in the Netherlands, but I know there are some small mountains.
Hills,
exactly. Yeah. But some are very much just tick box exercises. Are not pretty places to go to. Some of them, I remember one of them being a car park. One's just a little concrete slab in a farmer's field in was it Liechtenstein? No, that was Luxembourg.
Yeah, Luxembourg was essentially a rock in the middle of a field with not much else around it. And actually, I remember we had a bit of a debate at the time because we were using a satellite phone to establish the altitude. It's probably worth me pointing out at this point that, me and Adam started the challenge together, but only Adam is the one that actually broke the record.
Right.
And as you alluded to, like, there is sort of an escalating difficulty with doing each of the high points. So we sort of started together and we were ticking them off. And then I basically suffered like a recurrence of a back injury. So ultimately, Adam went on to complete it. And I think something else that Adam missed that's quite would be a good thing to point out is we did have like a really useful book, basically, that someone had written, which we essentially bought off Amazon, and that was like a really useful tool. So that's what we were referencing during the trip. And then sort of using, in some cases when it was a bit ambiguous where the highest point was. Malta is another place that comes to mind as well, where it's on some cliffs. And yeah, the other one being Luxembourg, where we essentially were sort of using a satellite phone to discuss where we thought the highest point was. So there was actually some ambiguity at times.
So what kind of proof do you have to show for Guinness? I mean, they must have, do you have to take...
In short, a lot. There was probably half a dozen list of requirements I had to follow. Of course, GPS data was key. I had to have a GPS device on me at the start of the hike, recording me for the full duration of the hike from the summit all the way back down again. I had to take quite a few photos, lots of video. If I remember rightly, it was roughly 3 minutes of video footage for every hour of the hike. I had to take 3 photos from different angles from the summit. I also had to get witness statements from every country, 2 witness statements from every country, which I actually didn't get close to, and I nearly didn't get my record at the end of it because of that. But and a full basically diary of events for 6 months, where I stayed, basically if I got any flights, I needed to keep track of them. It was quite a lot of detail. There's certainly no way to forge it.
Oh, wow. So it took you 6 months.
Yes, it did take me 6 months. It was, part of the experience was the road trip. We were sightseeing. We were still going about our daily, lives and, commitments back at home. So the record was one part of it. The other side of it was the road trip and sightseeing. But yeah, it was a 6-month period, and the mountains were a massive part of that.
Wow. I guess I didn't realize, even though you probably said this, Iain, I didn't realize that it was a road trip to do this. So that your road
That's right.
Europe, like I didn't realize those two went together. I didn't know if they were two separate.
We probably should explain at the start. Us 3 who started the challenge, we actually bought a car between us. It survived. It was just a cheap 4x4, wasn't it? And we had a bit of fun with it. There were some breakdowns, and
it was a 2006 Kia Sportage. Wasn't much research that went into it, but this was essentially the road trip that led me to starting the blog. So we basically started in Chester, which is where all 3 of us are from, and the whole trip was completed in this car, basically. Although there was some points on the trip where we had to like leave the car in random car parks and catch flights to places, obviously places like Malta, Cyprus and things like that weren't accessible in a quick way. But yeah, that was essentially the start of it. And also I think another person that we drew inspiration from was a woman named Emma who has a blog, which I think it's called 49 Peaks. I'm not sure if you remember the name, Adam, but Basically, there was someone who was a travel photographer, and I stumbled across the blog and saw lots of these images of the high points. So that was also like an inspiration for coming up, like, for the idea.
Yeah, it's just for reference 49peaks.com. It's a woman from Sweden who did it the year previously to me. Over a longer period. But she did it on the unofficial route, unofficial in reference to Guinness. So she just started it and did it without any kind of prior approval, if you like, from Guinness, and didn't collect the same requirements. But essentially, she was the previous record holder unofficially.
So the Kia held up okay. Any major incidents on the road trip?
I'll let you answer that one, Adam.
Yeah, well, I got carried away off-roading in Serbia, and I was going down all kinds of dirt roads and tracks, and thinking it was some kind of decent Land Rover Discovery or something like that. I ended up breaking. Was it the suspension arm I broke or something like that?
So we took it to a garage in Munich to ask about changing the tires, and we were told that we absolutely cannot leave the garage in this car. And they lifted it up on a ramp, and essentially one of the wheels was almost detached because I'm not sure the exact name for the part, but essentially the suspension had just totally failed on it. But we got it fixed, and ultimately it completed the whole thing, which I'm not sure if you know the total distance, Adam. What do you think it would have been?
35,000 kilometers driving we did.
35,000 kilometers. That's pretty impressive.
In 6 months.
Apart from the wheel, there was just one of the belts went in Spain, and that was about it. So it was actually a very reliable car. And when I eventually sold the car, I told the next buyer sort of the story of it. Didn't make much difference to the fact that it didn't sell for much, unfortunately, because it had been through, a
lot.
The wars. Yeah.
So was it a British left-hand drive?
Yes, it was.
Right-hand drive.
Because most of Europe is whatever the opposite is, right?
Yeah. Apart from England. So in England, we drive on the left and the wheels on the right. So, but yeah, in Europe, it was left-hand driving. Which,
when I've done that either way, I mean, it's hard to see sometimes when you're coming around the corner.
Yeah.
The worst is getting out of car parks.
Yeah.
You always need a passenger to get out of car park.
Right.
Either that or at nighttime on a smaller road, and you're like, okay, I have no idea what anybody's doing, so let's go down this side. Oh, that's the wrong side. Let's go down the other one.
Yeah, that and roundabouts. Circles can be challenging at night when there's no other traffic to follow.
So give us a quick rundown of your route. So you started in Chester.
We went, I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head myself. We went
Ireland first, and that was actually quite a dangerous one, wasn't it? Because we got stuck in a storm on the very first mountain. And fortunately, we had the satellite phone, which allowed us to navigate back down again. But we sort of learned some pretty important lessons immediately on the first mountain, about planning a bit more carefully around the weather. Ireland was the first one, and then we went down back through the UK, and it was Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg next. And then what was it next, Adam? Down to
we drove down to Andorra, made the attempt there too early, but we'd leave it a couple more weeks, so we drove to the Spanish and Portuguese high points, or the Portuguese first, then the Spanish, Gibraltar, back up again. Did Andorra on the second attempt, back up. And then it
was Monaco,
San Marino, and then we skirted around it in the Balkans, didn't we? And ended up to the bottom towards Greece.
Yeah, and then you left the car there, didn't you? And that's when we did the quick run.
Yeah, we took some of the flights to, where did we go? That was the Malta. We flew back into Rome to the Vatican.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, it was initially Ireland through the UK.
Yeah.
down to Spain and Portugal, back up and across to Monaco, San Marino. Then you went down through the Balkans and then took a plane to Malta, Vatican City, and then Bulgaria, Turkey, Serbia, and all that sort of area. And then we also did Greece around that time.
We're trying to do it in the kind of logical which one's closer, but we also, my experience wasn't great at the time, so we specifically avoided the Alps until I started to gain some more experience in the mountains, more fitness, and also we needed to wait for the weather window to open. So we were specifically waiting for kind of like the July, August periods really to get to the high ones in the Alps doing Mont Blanc. So I think overall, if I look back on it, I was pretty happy with the route we did end up taking. Some mountains we did, a bit too early maybe, but it was, I think overall, were you happy enough with it?
I think it made a lot of sense given the weather window for the Alps, and like you said, so after the Baltic, the Balkans sort of area, you did a big run in the Alps, didn't you? Where you did multiple serious ascents in a row. And then after that, did you go up to Scandinavia at that point?
Yeah, what did we do? We finished off Slovakia, and
I think this is evidence of how hectic it was, that it's actually difficult to remember the route. I mean, it's difficult to, obviously the truth is we basically had a book with all the high points in it, and it was essentially just, right, where's the next country that has a high point that, the weather is acceptable and there's a window to do it. But I think you've said to me a number of times, haven't you, Adam, that one of the biggest challenges of this was actually like the logistics, like basically just getting to the base of every high point.
Yeah.
Just because of the distribution of them, and some of them are not accessible. And then you've got these additional challenges with the weather, your experience level. And I think something else important to note is that if you don't get them all done by about October, then essentially you have to wait until the following climbing season. So in order to break the record, you needed to try and do it in a single climbing season.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was kind of pushing it to the end. As I was getting more and more into it, I started, I wanted a big one to finish on. And, I did the Alps. So that kind of left me Russia to finish on. And I very nearly, didn't get that because I was at the very back end of their season. The storms are coming in. It was actually a second attempt while I was on the mountain. I had to finish it off basically. And there was quite a few people in our group that didn't end up getting it when we started because they didn't have enough time on their visas, etc. So it did come down to the wire up until the very last one, really. I was questioning it on the night before I submitted because it was literally the last day I could have stayed in Russia without me expiring on my visa.
Yikes.
So, yeah.
You don't want to do that in Russia.
No.
No.
Not even back then. Yeah.
No.
Well, that was only a couple of years ago. So were you including the Caucasus in this Europe group?
No. So again, going back to Guinness, they use what the UN define as Europe, and the Caucasus they're actually defined as in the Asian region.
Well, that's what I agree with.
Yeah. So you do have to get quite a bit into all these technicalities. Like there's some high points off the mainland, for example, as well. We'd have to do research into all of those kind of disputes and arguments. If you get into the politics, and it is quite interesting actually. This book references quite a lot of it, and it's a lot more than I thought it was doing. I thought it'd be a very straightforward list, but even there's a few people out there dispute the mountains I've done. They've said I should have done a different one out in the mid-Atlantic or whatever. Particularly the Spanish one, I think is one we could dive into.
There's a Spanish one on the Canary Islands, which is so the Spanish high point based on geographical Europe is Mulhacen, which is in the Sierra Nevada region, like quite close to Malaga. But I believe it's called Teide on Tenerife.
Portuguese.
That's the Spanish one, but also the Portuguese one as well. It's
Azores,
on one of the
isn't
islands, basically. Yeah, I think it's Azores.
Azores, yeah. Yeah, that would get some interesting questions. But Guinness recognized it, right? So
that's what
safe.
counts.
It does go back to, there was an original holder to this. The official record was about 2 years. And it was another British guy who did it, but I think he did it that long ago. They didn't actually have a list of mountains that he did. I can't remember the year he did it, but when I remember
it was
looking,
a previously held record.
Yeah.
And actually, the previous guy that did it, if I remember correctly, he'd been held up quite a bit in completing the challenge due to some conflicts that were occurring in the Balkan region at the time. So I believe it had taken him, about 2 years to do it. And it was quite a while ago, I think. And so, as Adam said, like, there was quite a bit of discussion with Guinness at the beginning just to establish the list of mountains. Did you have any difficulties at the end, Adam, when you were submitting the evidence?
Looks like what I went back to before. I didn't gather as much data, particularly my flaw was I needed to get 2 witness statements in every country, whereas we were in and out of countries I didn't even see 2 people. Some of these mountains are very much off the beaten and tourist tracks. You're going in you see very few people in some of them. Some of them are on the edges of the borders, so you kind of only just in the country, if you can class it that, much as seeing the country at all. So I only came back with about half the witness statements roughly I needed, and I had to go back through all my socials, all my numbers, everyone I collected any kind of information from at the time, message them all and say, look, I really need your help, and can you fill in this witness form and say you saw me? It was all obviously true. I did meet these people on the trip, but when you're meeting people socially, you don't always fill in this form for me, please. But a lot of them came back to me, and Guinness did eventually say I did it.
That's amazing.
It was a very good news. I was very happy when I said that. As much as I know it's just a piece of the paper at the end of the day, but the memories are far more important to me. And it's actually been great to come on here and just look back through all the photos again. It's brought back a lot of memories and a lot of stories. I've just been having a couple of chats before we come on here, just reliving these memories essentially.
Well, when you look back on a trip, whenever I look back on a trip, there's always 1 or 2 things that I always tell the stories for. Like, those are the ones that stick out the most for whatever reason. So which ones are the ones that you always tell the stories for?
I'm going to go back to Russia because that was very emotional for me. Because, like I said, it did come down to the wire, and I ended up having to leave my guide on the mountain. So it was a group of 10 of us to start with on a group organized summit trip to the top of Mount Elbrus, with some Russian locals, which they kind of help you out with the immigration and the transports and logistics and all the rest of it. So that was very helpful. Out the 10 people that started, we had to come back down on the second accommodations day because a storm was coming in. So we went up the first day, came back down again because of the storm, and we had to forget our summit attempt in a day or so's time, which left a lot of people, 6 or 7, I remember rightly, just immediately without the time extension on their visas to be able to do it. However, I had a few extra days, which I wanted to go around Moscow and see a bit of St. Petersburg or whatever. Anyway, the mountain was more important. And on my summit day, again, the weather wasn't the best. There was still quite high winds. 3 of us started off. A guide, a local Russian, a very big, very fit bloke. He'd been training for this all year, but unfortunately he suffered from altitude sickness. And so out of the 3 of us, he was the biggest one by quite a while. I'm not the biggest person. I don't weigh an awful lot, and the guide was, kind of some similar physique than me, and he recognised this big guy was getting altitude sickness, and he goes, he's not going to make it. We need to turn back. So I tried to convince him we need to, 10 more minutes. He said he's not going to get any better. If he falls over, he's going to take both of us with him, which it's as serious as people have died doing parts of Elbrus. So he knew my record, he knew it was my last attempt, and I ended up having to really plead for him. And he got out his phone and made me record. He made me say, my guide has told me to go back down. I understand the risks involved. Only then he would let me go and click me and say, best of luck to you. And I did the last 400 meters, by myself, and ended up at the top with only one other Russian person there. Didn't speak any English. We shared a cup of tea at the top of.
And he said your form.
He didn't. No. It was so cold up there. I took a few photos and my fingers were frozen already. I wasn't feeling too well up at the top of there.
I'm sure. I mean, I've had altitude sicknesses.
It's no fun.
No fun.
Yeah.
So part of this whole thing then, Iain, was the road trip part of it. And I guess you were more in charge of that piece of it. Were you the driver, or do you guys share driving? How'd you do the paperwork for all the countries?
We actually shared the driving quite a lot, just because of some of the distances that were involved. And obviously with time being such a big factor.
I would say 2 out of the 3 of us shared the driving well. Our other friend, we had a third friend. 10 minutes and crashed it.
we had, so there was, as I said earlier, there was 3 of us on the trip. Yeah. So originally, I sorted out the car, but all 3 of us were on the insurance, which meant that any of us could drive it. And it's pretty simple driving around Europe with like a UK insurance policy. You basically just have to get some additional paperwork from your provider, which covers you in most countries. But we were basically buying insurance on the borders a lot of the time to sometimes use the insurance for just a day, just to go in and out of places. So logistically, it was actually, with regards to the car, as I said earlier, it held up really well. But we did have a third friend who, he didn't want to share as much of the driving. On the one day that he drove the car, he immediately crashed it into genuinely within an hour of having control of the car. He fortunately, it was only minor. He basically hit a bollard, and sort of dented. Yeah, he just basically dented the side of the car. But yeah, I mean, essentially that was a big part of what made it fun, was that, we obviously wouldn't have had a budget to fly everywhere. So, going in the car, not only was it sort of more budget friendly because we were splitting everything 3 ways, but also, we got to stop in lots of interesting places. I mean, something me and Adam were talking about before we came on the call was like a really interesting place that we just randomly came across in Estonia when we were driving from the Estonian high point to the Latvian high point. And it was essentially like it was a Soviet vehicle sort of graveyard, which basically just had like hundreds of Soviet era vehicles, like just the most bizarre things you've ever seen. And it was sort of like a roadside museum. You could basically pay a donation and then go in and walk around and see all these vehicles and things. And then aside from that, we also just obviously stopped in lots of little towns that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. I mean, as Adam alluded to, lots of the high points were actually in very secluded places. I mean, Moldova, obviously you would have visited there if you've been to all the countries, and it was basically a TV mast in a field was the highest point. Yeah.
So when you hit places like that, though, did you have to have a minimum hike to get there, or can you just say, well, let's just drive up this little road and boom, we're there.
It's generally, can't really hike to him. So as long as you're at the summit of these places, obviously I did want to, wherever possible, go on a hike near it just to, I don't want to drive everywhere. It was quite nice to get out of the car. But some of them, you literally are starting, or it is in a car park. It's, So in
the Netherlands is a good example, isn't it, Adam, where we chose to walk up the hill, even though there was a road that went right to the top, because obviously we'd just driven all the way there specifically to go to this point. So we kind of made a point of walking up from the bottom, even though, sometimes there is just a road that goes right to the top.
Well, that's kind of interesting. We used to live in the Netherlands. We lived there for 2 years.
Yeah.
So where in the Netherlands was it? Because it is such a flat country. Like I don't know if I've ever been.
It was. I remember it being near the tri point in between the three countries.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I just trying to find the details.
It was a very small hill, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In fact, I think it was almost exactly on that tri point, because I think after we did the high point, we were walking around right next to the border.
So it's very close between the tri point in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And it was called, if I'm getting the pronunciation right, Valsenburg.
What was the most difficult one to get to as far as red tape or administration? Like, I can imagine the Vatican. You can't really go everywhere in the Vatican without special permission.
So that was another interesting one. There's two disputes, because essentially the Vatican is almost fully built over. It's not by any means natural anymore. The gardens have been landscaped. So there are two alternative views. There's one high point in the garden, which is the highest outdoor bit, which is not fully accessible to the public. There's special open days and slots you can go there. But we chose basically the top of the cathedral. We walked to the top, although it's built up on it. It's not natural. It's essentially still had to climb to what we saw as a top point of the Vatican. It's 500 odd steps. Yeah.
The top of is it St. Paul's?
No, it's St. Paul's is the London one. It's St. Peter's Dome.
St. Peter, yeah.
St. Peter's Dome. Yeah. I know you can always climb to the top of those domes. It's like 600 and some odd steps or whatever.
I mean, the Turkey one was tricky, wasn't it, Adam?
Yes, but again, we did the European side of Turkey, not the Asian side. So again, it was one of our there's nothing special there. Actually, on top of this, the high point is a military base, is a live military listening post, which is occupied. You're not supposed to go there there's nothing there but military. Mm-hmm. And we didn't see a few signs. We drove straight up this road and we came to the top. And there was a group of very confused people in kind of military overalls, and they just told us to go down very quickly. They weren't very happy with that.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Turkey is really fascinating that way. The fact that you can just drive to these places that
you shouldn't.
You're not supposed to drive to, but yet there is nothing stopping you. Yeah, we've driven all over Turkey too.
I'm sure if you looked a bit more closely, you'd find a few signs to say, do not.
So, wow. So you did the European side of Turkey. That's like a DNA in that area. The same thing with Russia then? That part is in the European part of Russia as well?
So Russia's, about a third of the overall country size is technically in Europe. The other 2/3 is Asia. But it so happens to be their highest mountain, Elbrus, is on the European part of Russia.
So how many were like real mountaineering places? Elbrus sounds like it was. And in the Alps, was that about it?
Yeah, there's top of my head. There's probably about 5 you'd probably, if you didn't have much experience, you'd probably want to use a guide for. Some are quite severe mountains. There's probably another 5 to 10, which are just a really big mountain. And as the list goes on, there are some basic walks in the park anyone can do. My gran could probably do a few of them. It's but it is quite a nice exercise to do, because I didn't have any mountaineering experience before I started this challenge. It's something I learned that I liked as I was on it. I basically, my highest point I'd been to up until that point is the one in Wales, Snowdon, which is only about 1,000 meters above sea level. Where I was doing mountains at the tallest was Elbrus, 5,600. So it's a big magnitude of difference between my previous experience to then starting this challenge.
In the Alps, which is the tallest mountain? Is Mont Blanc?
Mont Blanc, yes, shared between Italy and France.
Yeah. The Dolomites, they have some pretty high mountains there.
I drove through the Alps, and I was through the Dolomites, and I was a bit gutted I didn't have time to stop and do a bit more exploring, because it was, as part of this whole challenge, I did have a time limit of about 6 months. I had personal commitments back at home, and I needed to finish up and get back and to back home to see family and friends and all the rest of it, and get back to work because I was running out of money. Yeah, so it did make it quite high pressure. You didn't always get to stop everywhere you wanted to, but it's part of the nature of the challenge, really.
Yeah, it's the same with road trips in general. You almost always find yourself driving through an area thinking, wow, this is amazing, but now I'm on this little bit of a schedule and I've got to get to the next place. Well, next time I'm on the road, maybe I'll do it. So you talked a little bit about budget, and also I'm thinking, when I think of hiking, I think of camping. So what kind of accommodations did you have along the way? Was it like, we're going to go as cheap as possible, drive from point to point, camp out, or hostels, or what was the plan there?
It was a massive mix of stuff, to be honest, from hostels to, I did actually sleep probably overall a couple of weeks in the car, particularly as I was getting around the more expensive parts. And I had some very long days of drive, and it just made sense sometimes just to pull over, have a few hours in the back and get going the first thing in the morning. Not so many hotels. I was trying to keep it budget sensitive, and I do enjoy a hostel experience. On the mountains, there's a lot of mountain huts around the ones we were doing. The high points of the country are generally quite popular with tourists, and there's always some kind of accommodation there. Don't recall any I had to camp on. But again, I was trying to keep my backpack as light as possible when I was on these hikes. It's just a lot of the time, if anything, I just took a sleeping bag to a mountain hut.
We stayed in a really nice mountain refuge, didn't we, on Mount Olympus, and did that as a 2-day hike. And we did the summit at sunrise, which was probably my favorite memory from the whole trip, was just getting up really early. And it's a really nice view, essentially, that hike up to the top of Mount Olympus, which is the highest point of Greece. Which is down on the Peloponnese Peninsula, or? Yeah, it's down just south of Thessaloniki. Yeah. Okay. Just south from there.
I often find that mountain peak sunrises can be really hit or miss. Sometimes
it's always a little disappointing, isn't it? You get that early morning in, you get up, you walk for many hours, and you get there and it's an overcast day. But
right.
It's when it all works out for you, it's just nothing better, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is magical. Yeah.
So what's next for you guys? For both of you? Like, do you have any big, I mean, how do you top this anyway? But, do you have any big plans or big road trips or big...
I'd love to do something similar again. Of course, everyone asks me the same thing, really, and I would do this again in a heartbeat. It was truly one of the best experiences, but I was initially looking at Africa. Africa is a very different beast, but also very interesting, doing a similar thing there. Of course, it then steps up the gear again. It's a much bigger challenge in Europe. It's a lot of new issues there as well. But there's also a record there I kind of think could be beaten at some point.
Is that right?
Has anyone ever done that?
Yeah, the current record is 5 years. They say it was actually the same person that originally did Europe.
Really?
It's the same guy.
Oh, you can't take both of his records.
The thing about in Africa is the unrest. I mean, there's a lot of.
Yeah, I know that's some of that's coming up at the moment, isn't it? But again, as in terms of a road trip, that really interests me, and I do like going to these places that are off the beaten track a little bit, which are away from the tourists, and but at the same time, that comes with its own risks and issues, really. Like I said, you've been around Africa. You probably know it's probably a little bit different in driving around Europe in some areas. I've not been there myself, but
it's
I could only imagine.
Different.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just in terms of, I mean, really everything: getting gas, getting petrol, and where you can stay, and
crossing the borders can be really challenging. Lots of paperwork. Yeah, the logistics would be
a little bit hard, I think.
But I think the payout is amazing because the driving there is really incredible.
But like we were on the border of the Republic of Congo for a couple of days, and we debated, whether we should go in, but it's so dangerous. It's right during a time where they were kidnapping tourists for ransom, and we're like, I don't know. I mean, I want to go to the Republic of Congo. The closest we got is we stood at the mouth of the river and we waved about 20, 25 feet across. We're like, hi, Congo. And that's about it because it was just a little too scary, I think. Even though we've never felt threatened, and we may have been okay, who knows, but it's so hard to balance sometimes that adventure versus, is it
safety? Yeah. It's still interesting nonetheless. I follow the odd person on Instagram doing African trips just to see how we get along and just take ideas and notes. And there's all sorts of very interesting people on all sorts of modes of transport going across Africa. So I do keep an eye on it. But again, it's a very, very big commitment. I don't know if I'd ever get around to doing it, but it's a very interesting opportunity, in my opinion.
And there are a few other people that have kind of taken up the same hobby of sort of doing as many high points as possible, isn't there? So there's potentially some people you could reach out to and actually, get some feedback from.
When you've said you've been to every state as well as every country in Europe, I actually bumped into an American person in the middle of Bosnia. I didn't see anyone else all day, but it was an American bloke. He left his wife at the bottom of the mountain and he'd gone up it. And he said he'd climbed up to the highest point in every state with his best friend. And now he was into his 60s probably, I guess. And now he says he's going to do as much of Europe as he possibly can. He was going around doing a similar kind of high point challenge. It's an interesting story.
That's cool.
Good stuff. Yeah. Good stuff.
How about you, Ian? What's up next for you?
Well, I'm just sort of finishing up 3 months in Southeast Asia, but when I get back, I'm moving to Gran Canaria, basically in the Canary Islands. So I'm leaving England, essentially. So I'm going to go and set up base there.
For good or for a short?
I think it'll be for at least 4 years. My girlfriend's starting a job there.
Yeah, we're moving to Germany here pretty soon.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Getting back to Europe, where we spent lots of time already. But we've been.
Yeah, I read on the blog that you were teachers, essentially, like teaching in various locations around the world. That must have been very, very enjoyable.
Yeah, our entire careers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but now we're retired, so now we're just full-time traveling, and when we can, spending time with our grandkid. Yeah, it's the dream. We love it. Well, any last-minute, pieces of advice or interesting stories that we haven't really had a chance to hear about?
I would certainly say, it's a bit cliche, if you got an opportunity to take some time off and do a bit of traveling, I've experienced nothing better. I continually, ever since I've done this challenge, is to try and chase that same 6 months again, at least in a small part. Just that feeling of freedom and just to get to see different places, meet new people. It's a very big world out there with a lot of very interesting things happening in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's what we're always preaching.
Right. Well, thanks both of you for coming and joining us today. Fascinating. Just having the discussion and talking about climbing all the high points. I can't even imagine the logistics of that. So that's amazing. Well done.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Streets and Eats. If you liked what you heard, please show us some love, hit the like button, and leave us a review. Maybe even subscribe so you don't miss any future podcasts. Also, we'd love it if you joined us on our Facebook private group, Streets and Eats, where we just have an ongoing conversation about all things travel. Ciao for now.